Grief doesn't end. It changes, though. When I first wrote Heart Lessons, my family was still grieving the loss of my brother Buck. What I couldn't know then was how much more grief that life would ask me to carry. Since writing that book, I've also lost my brother Brad, my father, and my mother. The lesson isn't that grief goes away. The lesson is that grief changes shape. I can't really say that when I wrote Heart Lessons, I thought I understood grief. I don't think I really did. In fact, going back to grad school is like psychotherapy on steroids. It teaches you all of these new methods and tools and psychological principles. And at the time when you're in school like that, you don't have any other measure to understand. So you start thinking about yourself. You're actually working on your own stuff. And so that's when I started to understand grief a little bit more. So here is from Heart Lessons. I'm going to share with you a passage from Lessons in Grief, but I'm not going to share you the personal thing. I'm going to share with you about how it manifests itself in many ways. I wanted this to be more of a teaching lesson for you rather than my personal grief journey and what I understood at the time. So grief manifests itself in many ways. The symptoms I felt after losing my brother were similar to the grief I felt as a result of my health crisis. The following journal entries show every stage of grief: anger, bargaining, depression, denial, and later, the acceptance. But like life, grief is not linear. We weave in and out of stages, even experiencing them simultaneously at times. Grieving is an ongoing process. I worked as a grief counselor while I was in grad school, and for quite a while afterwards. I continued to educate clients to accept that their grief is real. It comes in waves, and symptoms can appear due to any kind of loss. That's what's really important, any kind of loss. Sometimes it's following a crisis, other times occurring over time. Grief can also feel hopeless. It takes time to navigate your way through it. The best way is with some help. Don't try to go through it alone, or worse yet, deny it. It is often better to make the decision to face it now and avoid prolonging the pain because you buried it, thinking that it was the best way to handle it. Grief can seem ominous, but studies prove that seeking help causes one to heal faster and thereby creating a healthy mindset sooner. Notice that there are similar causes of a sudden crisis. Here are some examples of loss: death of a friend or loved one, failing health, end of a job or career, end of a relationship, financial loss, loss of a home, children leaving home. Any type of significant loss can present you with symptoms of grief. It's important to be able to identify the symptoms. Once you are aware that you are actually grieving, you'll be able to understand your reactions and make decisions about how you might wish to respond. There are times when you just need to allow yourself to grieve the loss. And that is from the Lessons in Grief chapter from my book, Heart Lessons, which you can get downloaded for free anytime. And you can read all of it. So getting back to, when I wrote Heart Lessons, I'll tell you, this has been an interesting time for me to reflect on the 20-year anniversary of heart failure. Changing the career and that decision didn't happen in the blink of an eye. It didn't happen once I got out of the hospital. But the thing is that it has brought up a lot of the grief of the last 20 years that has gone along with it. It's like I said, I thought I understood grief because my brother Buck, I think it was 23 years earlier, my brother Buck had died. And so my family was already experienced in a lot of loss, not just the death of a loved one, but we had had significant losses in other ways. But I didn't know that either until I started to educate myself. So when I wrote Heart Lessons at the time, we were grieving Buck. I was recovering from the heart failure and had just finished grad school and was still trying to understand life again, really just trying to rebuild. But here's the critical part. And I had a conversation with somebody recently, a client who was considering changing their career path, midway through in midlife, and concerned about, what they were supposed to do. And I was able to give them that peace of mind. My decision to change my career from radio to becoming a psychotherapist, one, it didn't happen overnight. And two, by the time it took me a couple of years to actually make that decision, not because I was confused, but because I was still ill. I still had to recover. And once I was recovered and the old path wasn't working for me, that's when I knew I needed a new path. So if you're in a situation right now where you're finding that the path that you're currently on is no longer working for you, well, now it's time to make a shift. So the acknowledgement happened, the things that have happened in the last 20 years. Well, my brother Brad died in 2015. And then my dad died in 2023. And my mom died in 2025. So I have experienced that level of grief. All of my family members, except for one brother's left, have died. And the loss feels different for each of them. And I explain that to a lot of my clients also. It's the relationship with my brother Bach and my age and the time frame that we were in 1983, significantly different than my age, my brother Brad's age, and what was going on in our lives when he died. It doesn't mean it's less important. It's just a different type of loss that feels much different. And that's, grief is grief. And if you've lost your job, lost your career, and I know there's a lot of my friends out there who have, I know there's a lot of people that you're at a stage in your life that there's big changes coming. And maybe you've reached a certain age where you're like, this career path or this relationship is no longer working out for me. And it's time to consider a new path. One of the things that I teach, and I only teach it because I've learned it, really, I've learned, and then I teach, is that grief isn't something that you finish. You don't get over it. You learn how to navigate through it. And it is something that you just learn to carry. You have to continue to live your life while you're grieving. And I think the first grief experience that my family had was when my brother Buck died. We went right back to the station and got to work. Honestly, it was kind of one of those things where you didn't have a choice, but what else could we do? Radio stations, you can't close. It's not like a furniture store or a sandwich shop where you could just close the door and stay shut and not operate for, a few weeks or whatever. It was a 24-hour operation. We had staff. We had to get right back to work. And I realized that that's still what I do. When my brother Brad died, I was working on my Kelly Richards Apple a Day. And I kept producing, I kept writing. It was how I didn't stay in the grief. And it was a creative project that was helpful and healthy for me. And then my dad was dying as I wrote Dead Air, the day the music died. And I don't really feel like I was on a mission to finish it before he died, but his later years caused me to have some, complicated grief. It was a very long goodbye with his heart issues and his Parkinson's and dementia. It's not like it was sudden. It was a long decline. And that was also filled with grief. Just, that was, we call that pre-bereavement. We're getting ready, and so when he died, I stopped writing for a while and that was just mainly just because I just didn't have it in me. But once I was able to regroup and realize, okay, part of my grief process is to get back into the writing the story. And since the story origin came from the work I did with my dad, working on that book was really helpful. And then when the book was ready to launch, my mom died right after the book launched, like within 2 weeks before my first, official appearance back in the broadcast industry, in that little ecosystem of radio. So these are all things that have occurred since my heart failure, since I changed my career, since I wrote all of these books. I'm not just teaching grief as a theory here. I'm actually still living it every day. Even this past weekend, I'm processing complicated grief. So even though I'm here, I'm not sharing all of my struggles, but I am sharing what I've learned. And hopefully some of the tools will begin to help you. And maybe you'll just decide it's time to download Heart Lessons and it's time to follow Kelly on whether it's my Substack or it's on YouTube or on any social media where you find me. Follow me. And because I'm always going to give you something good. I'm writing. I got my dog. I got my trailer. I'm traveling the country. I've got the courtyard at the Radio and Records Cafe. And this month, it's been all about Heart Lessons, the story that started all of this new journey. And how does this all connect to licensed to be badass? Well, the S in badass, the first one, it stands for stay the course. So no matter what is going on with your life, if you're making some progress, if you're growing and you're making some changes and you've made some decisions that it's time to, we've covered self-awareness, we've covered listening, we've covered letting go. Now we're focused on the grief and we are going to stay the course. So this is really important. It is for me too. I have all these projects that I'm working on, and when you get kind of in a grief episode, where you're sad about a loss, any loss, like we've discussed, you could be like, throw up your hands and just, what's the point? Well, give up. But it's every single day, every little bit that you do toward this new path that you are creating for yourself is what's going to really get you to that point. It's getting back up. It's taking the next step. Like for me, writing the next page, showing up for the people that you love. Staying the course through grief is different than staying the course through success, but it matters just as much. So, as I was writing Pepper's story, there's a portion in a chapter in there where she has a significant loss. And I'll be honest, I was able to read through some of my journals, some of the things that I've written about grief in my own personal writing, and I was able to create that scene for Pepper that is extremely realistic. I'll be honest, when I have read through it, since I'm editing and working through it, and I've gone through that scene again, I do cry because that's part of the grief process. So like I said before, Dead Air helped me process grief with my dad writing it. And then returning to the manuscript allowed me to hear his encouragement all over again. Be willing and be open to having those kinds of experiences. You may not be a writer, but journaling would help. You could write letters to that loved one. If we're talking about the death of a loved one, if you're talking about a job loss, a career loss, let's consider all of the things that you have lost. And let's really just honor that. Give yourself permission to do it, but then that's when you have to pick up and step forward and say, okay, what now? And that's part of badass. Stay the course once you make that decision. Stories give us a place to put emotions when we don't yet have words. And so that's why I like writing stories, because I have a lot of words. And one thing that I've learned is that all of my years of writing my thoughts and feelings in a journal help me focus, help my clients do that. And they help in my creative nonfiction writing as well. In my book, both Perry and Pepper experience something that causes them to grieve deeply. And then through the story, you'll be able to see how they processed through the grief. It's not always good. It's not always bad. It just is. You see, the characters aren't autobiographical, but there's definitely a little bit of me in each of them. But understanding my own grief helps deepen every story I write. And that is understanding that wasn't available to me 20 years ago. I've earned it. So here's some of the things that I've not only learned, but that I teach about helping you navigate loss. There is no correct timeline. It's not a race. You don't have to learn it real quick so you can get on with it. That's kind of my issue. I'm impatient. It's like, I know I have a lesson to learn. Let me learn it. Let me move on. Sometimes it just takes a little bit of time. Grief doesn't follow any specific rule. And people heal very differently and respond to grief differently. So show yourself some grace and mercy, as well as others around you. Love and grief are connected. If you're grieving something, it means that love was very significant, whether it was your job, your home, your community, or a loved one. And the depth of grief often reflects the depth of that connection. Don't forget those things. Give yourself a break and show yourself some compassion. So what has grief taught you about love, life, or yourself? So in closing, I'd like to invite you to download Heart Lessons. The link is in my comments. Subscribe to Substack or YouTube, or follow me on Instagram, wherever I am. I'm on social media, LinkedIn also. And then come back next week, because I'm going to have my final reflection on Heart Lessons and the failure that changed my life. Grief doesn't ask us to stop living. It asks us to carry love forward in a different way. If you enjoyed this conversation, I'd appreciate if you'd like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might enjoy it too. And if you'd like to go deeper, I invite you to join me in the courtyard on Substack. That's where I share the writing journey behind the Radio and Records Cafe trilogy, along with reflections on creativity, leadership, resilience, travel, and the stories that shape our lives. You'll find the link below, and I'd love to have you join us there.